Dear friends of the World Union, I've been called the architect of Reform Zionism. It is an honor to be so designated. I've written reminiscences of how we developed Reform Zionism, which is available to you through the World Union. At this time, I've been asked to review some excerpts of that article. From its inception, the Reform movement was anti-Zionist. The infamous Pittsburgh Platform of 1885 rejected the concept of Jews as a people. Instead, the rabbis declared that we are a religious community and we have no desire to return to Palestine. It was only in 1937, in cognizance of the rise of Hitler, that the Central Conference of American Rabbis adopted the Columbus Platform, advocating the building of a Jewish homeland. But here too, there's no mention of a Jewish state. To be sure, there were always ardent Zionists within the Reform rabbinate. Indeed, the leaders of the American Zionist movement, Rabbi Abiel Silver and Stephen Wise, were Reform rabbis. However, in their day, they were a minority within the Reform movement. They never attempted to establish a Reform Zionist movement. The vast majority of Orthodox Jewry were also opposed to Zionism, believing that only the Messiah should restore the Jewish people to Eretz Israel. Yet a minority of Orthodox Jews organized a Zionist party called Mizrahi. They inspired Orthodox Jews to make Aliyah, and they established educational, welfare, and cultural institutions in Eretz Israel. They became a political force to be reckoned with in the pre-state Zionist movement. None of the leadership of the Reform or conservative movements ever thought of organizing a party of liberal Jews within the Zionist movement. Had they done so, even if they were a minority within their own movements, later generations of liberal Jews would not have had to play catch-up ball. In 1961, I was appointed the founding director of the UAHC Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. In that capacity, I dealt with some of the major issues confronting American society, among them civil rights, church state, anti-poverty, foreign affairs, Vietnam. But the most important event was the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War exploded in 1967. In my experience, the Six-Day War had a greater impact on the relationship of world Jewry to Israel than even the establishment of the state itself in 1948. Israel had inspired the revival of the Hebrew language, education, and culture. The Jewish state had become in part consolation for the horrific tragedy of the Holocaust, and most important of all, the symbol of hope for the renewal of Jewish peoplehood. The Jerusalem program, adopted at the 1968 World Zionist Congress, proved controversial in the diaspora. Why? It proclaimed as the first aim of the Zionist movement the unity of the Jewish people and the centrality of Israel in Jewish life. The idea that Israel was central was unacceptable, even to many American Zionists. They developed a metaphor that they called Babylon Jerusalem to describe the relationship between the diaspora Jewry and Israel. Why Babylon? After the destruction of the temple and the conquest of Palestine in 586 BCE, the exiled community in Babylon developed into a major center of Jewish culture and creativity. Why Jerusalem? because the Jews who remained in Jerusalem and Palestine remained poor and needed the help of the Babylonian Jewish community. Hence, in our day, said American Jewry, we are Babylon, we in North America. And the community in Israel, that's Jerusalem. We are larger and wealthier, and it's our obligation to help them. But basically, we are two equal foci, Babylon and Jerusalem. Now, contrary to many Zionist leaders, I ardently advocated the centrality of Israel. In speeches and articles, I projected a new definition of the relationship, a new metaphor. I said, Israel is Broadway and the diaspora is off Broadway. Israel is the center stage of Jewish life. Israel represents Jewish peoplehood. Therefore, what happens to and in Israel represents the future of the Jewish people. It is the obligation of the diaspora to help build and nourish the center and to view Israel as one great campus of Jewish culture. From the American Jewish perspective, without the closest affinity to Israel and without active participation in the task of strengthening the center, American Jewry is in danger of becoming just another faith community. That which distinguishes the American Jewish community from every other ethnic group in America is its relationship to the Jewish state. Conversely, from the perspective of Israel, without the closest ties to diaspora Jewry, Israel is in danger of becoming a state just like all other states. I began to ask a very important question. Where was our Reform Judaism on Israel? I concluded that as a movement, Reform Judaism had failed in our relationship to Zionism. As a national movement, the UAHC, now the URJ, and the CCR had developed joint commissions on the major issues confronting the synagogue. There was a commission on Jewish education, on worship, on camps, on synagogue administration, and other areas of concern. But why was there no commission on Israel? So I spent the summer of 1967 drafting a proposal for the UAHC. I recommended the establishment of a national joint commission on Israel and committees on Israel in local synagogues. The proposals stressed the urgency of building a movement in Israel and suggested detailed recommendations for creating new Zionist-oriented institutions and programs in both Israel and America. My proposal was the main topic of the fall meeting of the UAHC-URJ staff. After I presented the proposal, most of the staff were enthusiastic until I came to allocating a budget for the work of the commission. I proposed that we reallocate the existing UAHC budget to include the budget for the new program, when the implication of my remarks meant that the existing departments of the union might lose some of their budget in the process. The entire staff reacted negatively, recognizing that my proposals for reallocation would deleteriously affect their own department budgets. Not wanting to jettison the entire program, I responded that I was so confident that the program that I had presented represented the thrust of the future, that I would volunteer to raise the additional funds in a special campaign, we called it the Dollar Campaign, outside the regular fundraising efforts of the union. I also suggested that until we could raise the necessary budget, we needed a director. I would temporarily serve as director of the commission, in addition to continuing my duties with director of the Religious Action Center, we drafted a resolution for the biennial of November 1987. At the biennial, tension arose between Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who was then the president of the Union, and Rabbi Jacob Shankman, president of the World Union, as to which institution should be responsible for developing the progressive movement in Israel. The tension was resolved when Rabbi Shankman proposed to Rabbi Eisendrath that in addition to my serving as director of the Joint Commission on Israel, I should also serve as chairman of the World Union Committee on Israel. Both men agreed, I assume by the assumption that I could not fight with myself and would do what was best for the movement as a whole. In my dual capacity with both the Union and the World Union, I was confronted with a major question. Which organization should assume ultimate responsibility for developing the movement in Israel? I knew that the non-American leaders were less likely to rally around the cause if it was centered in America, whereas I expected the American movement to raise most of the necessary funds. I convinced all my colleagues to make the World Union the framework for developing the movement in Israel. And I expressed the hope that if we were successful, the movement in Israel would become a major force in the world movement. We set to work immediately. The International Conference of the World Union in the summer of 1968 was scheduled to take place in Amsterdam. A few of us in leadership roles contended that in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, it was inconceivable that the conference would be held in any place but Jerusalem. So we transferred the conference to Jerusalem. And in July 1968, 400 delegates from around the world attended the first of many World Union conferences in Jerusalem. The announced objective of the conference was to express solidarity with our fellow Jews in the state of Israel and to lay the groundwork for the development of a significant reform movement in Israel. In 1969 and 70, Bell and I decided to spend our sabbatical year in Israel. We thought it would be an opportunity for our children to enrich their Hebrew language skills. You should know that our home, both in Chicago and Washington, was a Hebrew-speaking home. Our children grew up in a home where Sfat Ha'em, the language of the home, was Hebrew. And I knew it also would give us an opportunity to help advance the fledgling Israel movement. The year turned out to be fruitful. We established some new congregations and helped organize a national movement. We agreed that the World Union funds, which would be channeled to Israel, would be channeled through a national budget administered by Israelis. If our objective was to develop an indigenous Israel movement, it was essential to encourage Israeli responsibility. The editor of the Jerusalem Post asked me to write an article on the Israel-diaspora relations for the next decade. The article appeared prominently on the last page of the Jerusalem Post on December 31st, 1969. Many of our colleagues in the movement expressed severe criticism because the article reaffirmed my views that Israel, not America, was the center stage of Jewish life. However, to my surprise, Louis Pincus, who was chairman, and Leon Dulcin, treasurer of the Jewish Agency for Israel, waxed enthusiastic about the article, and they invited me to discuss with them Israel-diaspora relations and the character of the Zionist movement in the diaspora. During the course of the year, at their invitation, I met with them for many discussions. Before I returned to Washington in June, they asked me to become a member of the World Zionist Executive. After the Six-Day War, the Jewish Agency had gone through a process of reconstitution, and they had invited 3 American rabbis, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, to sit on the American section of the Zionist Executive. I was invited to be representative of, not representing, but representative of the Reform movement. And I began to sit on the executive of the WZO Jaffe in the fall of 1970 and was formally installed at the World Zionist Congress of 1972. And while I was sitting around the table, I began to ask myself a serious question. Why should I sit on the executive as an individual? Why should not the World Union join as an international organization? Would not the affiliation of the World Reform Movement with the Zionist movement be considered a significant achievement for both the Zionist movement and progressive Judaism? In reality, the proposal to affiliate with the WZO provoked considerable opposition among our Reformed Jewish leadership. The WZO did not have a good reputation in the Jewish world, not that it has such a great reputation now. I invited Leon Dulcin, now the chairman of the Jaffe WZO, to address the International Conference of the World Union in London in March of 1974. After an intense debate, the conference approved the decision to affiliate with the WZO. So in January 1976, we were officially welcomed into membership as an international organization. Our affiliation, in reality, changed the character of the WZO. Until that time, no synagogue movement had joined the WZO. Our affiliation inspired the conservative and Orthodox synagogue movements to join. Today, we see clearly how our affiliation changed the character of the Zionist movement. Within a year of the World Union affiliation, we recognized that to be a member of the WZO as an international organization was of limited value. It was the Zionist political parties which had access to funds and to positions of responsibility within the WZO structure. This led us to conclude that if we really aspired to wield influence in the institution, we should establish a political party within the WZO. To establish a Zionist political party obligated individual members of every party to sign the Jerusalem Program. It was essential to organize a political party in at least 5 countries. We launched ARTSA at the UAHC biennial in 1977, and thereafter Artsenu as the International Reform Zionist Movement in 5 different countries. I now would like to contend that the following actions by the World Union represent the most significant actions of Reform Judaism in the 20th century. They are proof of what I called at the title of the article, Lo HaMidrash Hu Ha'ikar Ela HaMaaseh, from the Pirkei Avot. It is not the words, but the deeds which count. I'll now explain why. 1, the transfer of the international headquarters from New York to Jerusalem. The World Union's move to Jerusalem was a transfer to the center stage of Jewish life. Thereby, Reform Judaism demonstrated that Jews are a living people, not a religious community as it was described in the Pittsburgh Platform. We were committed to restore the cultural creativity of Jewish people and to advance the destiny of the Jewish people. Reform Judaism shares in the mission and in the destiny of Jewish peoplehood. We are full and equal partners in the Jewish dream. Full partners cannot be silent partners. Equal partners not only demand equal rights, they also assume equal responsibility. 2, the affiliation of the World Union and Artsenu with the WZO Jaffe, established Reform Judaism as a full partner in the major international body of world Jewry. I maintained that to move the World Union to Jerusalem and not to affiliate with the Zionist movement was equivalent to leading the bride to the chuppah, but not putting a ring on her finger. 3, to build an Israel movement for reform and progressive Judaism. I raised an essential question. Progressive Judaism had been successful in developing synagogues in every country of Jewish settlement. However, if we were successful as a movement only in non-Jewish soil, and not in Jewish soil, not in Eretz Israel, then perhaps we're not a religious movement at all. Maybe we're only a sociological phenomenon. The ultimate test of our authenticity as a Jewish religious movement lays in our ability to develop a dynamic movement in Jewish soil. Otherwise, we'd be like a fish that can only live out of water. And a fish that lives out of water is not a fish. I contended that the primary task of the World Union, in cooperation with the Israel movement, and eventually under the leadership of the Israel movement, was to build religious, educational, and cultural institutions. I used the old Zionist song as our motto. Anu banu artsa livnot li banot ba. Anu banu artsa livnot li banot ba. We have come to Israel to build and to be built by her. I contended that in building a movement in Israel, our own diaspora Jewish community would be enhanced and inspired. We would be drawn closer to Jewish peoplehood and to the ultimate goals of Zionism. Over and over again, I preached the message. Our task is to root ourselves in the soil and in the soul of the Jewish people. Unless we root ourselves in the soil, we cannot root ourselves in the soul. So the World Union undertook responsibility for establishing institutions in Israel. And over the course of many years, the international movement contributed to the establishment of many institutions. I'm not going to go into detail about them, but Beit Shmuel, Merkaz Shimshon, congregations, settlements, Kibbutz Yahel, Kibbutz Laton, Kibbutz Lotan in the Arava, and Archalutz in the Galilee. We have the Leobek Educational Center in Haifa, synagogue community centers. The first building that we helped build was Beit Daniel. We have the Hebrew Union College Institute of Religion, which is the academic cultural center of our movement in Jerusalem, and which ordains an expanding core of Israeli Reformed rabbis and educators to lead and nurture our Israel movement. And we've institutionalized the struggle for pluralism, equal rights, and social justice for individuals, and equal status for the non-Orthodox movements, with the Israel Religious Action Center, the Women of the Wall, Chidush. 4, the move to Israel transformed the World Union into an operating agency. When the World Union transferred its headquarters to Jerusalem, it was obligated to change its character from a small coordinating agency to an operating agency. Beit Shmuel and Merkaz Shimshon required a huge staff and an administrative budget of millions of dollars. The new vision and the creative programs inspired all regions of the World Union to identify and to contribute the requisite funds. Well, what's the future of our Israel movement? Today, the Israel movement is thriving. It is constantly developing new congregations and expanding its educational and creative cultural programs. It is nourished by a never-expanding number of Israel rabbis ordained by HUCJIR. The Israel movement leadership, both lay and rabbinic, is Jewishly learned, dedicated, innovative, and politically effective. An increasing percentage of Israelis who are not identified with the liberal movements nevertheless advocate recognition of the reform and conservative movements. Because of the strong pull of the State of Israel, the leadership of our Israel movement is destined to become a major force in the world movement. They are the instrumentality for advancing the cause of pluralism and civil liberties for all citizens. I think it's of special significance that Rabbi Gilad Kariv was elected to the Knesset. His election is a remarkable personal achievement to which he's long aspired, and it is also of great significance for our movement. As a matter of policy, we have determined that our movement will never become a political party, and we shall not identify with any specific political party in Israel. Nevertheless, Rabbi Kariv will be a brilliant spokesman for our liberal, pluralistic, democratic values. He's already given a major address, and his leadership will project our liberal message to the broader Israeli public, and he will enhance the Knesset deliberations. Well, just a word about my decision to serve as the executive director of the World Union. During that sabbatical year in 69 and 70, I and others began to think seriously about transferring the international headquarters of the World Union to Israel. To begin with, I never thought of myself. I was very happy. Washington was a magnificent place to live in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and I had no intention of leaving that very exciting position. But I convinced the leadership of the World Union to think big and to authorize the dramatic decision to transfer the international headquarters to Jerusalem. They asked me to look for an international director, a person of great substance and distinction. And I met with 3 very distinguished rabbis, all of whom were scholars, all of whom were fluent in Hebrew, and unfortunately, none of them were willing to accept the position. So the executive of the World Union began to press me, and I really was not that interested, even though I had felt that I had pushed the movement to move its international headquarters, but I didn't want to go myself. And then in February of 1971, Dr. Alfred Gottschalk, the president of the college, Richard Scheuer, chairman of the Jerusalem campus, and later the chairman of the board, and I met with Prime Minister Golda Meir and Pinchas Sapir, the finance minister, to prevail upon them to give the college the land adjacent to the existing campus in order that we might establish the World Education Center for Progressive Judaism. And the idea of a joint undertaking with the college was very attractive. At the same time, I began to realize that if I did not assume responsibility, and if I did not accept the position of international director, and we couldn't find anybody else, then all of my efforts, after the long efforts I had made, the move might never take place. So after many hours of deliberation with Bella, many hours, we decided to accept the responsibility, and I became the executive head of the World Union. Now, what is our ultimate mission? In discussing the historic significance of the movement for progressive Judaism in Israel, I have often referred to an early Zionist movement called Bilu. This was the first movement of young pioneers from Eastern Europe to organize as a settlement movement in 1882. Before that, Jews who had settled in the land of Israel had come for religious reasons, to pray, to study, to wait for the Messiah, to die and be buried in the Holy Land. The Bilu rejected the religious approach. Instead, they adopted a political objective to establish settlements of Jews who would farm the land and form indigenous communities. Since these early pioneers had no training in agriculture, and since the conditions in Palestine were so harsh and inhospitable, they experienced hardship, disease, and frustration. Some were unable to endure and returned to Europe, but others courageously persisted. The pioneering efforts of the Bilu inspired others to follow. The entire early period of settlement became known as the First Aliyah, and it set the stage for other waves of immigration to follow. The efforts of those early pioneers were considered heroic because the fledgling settlements that they created demonstrated the potential. Indeed, I think that had their pioneering efforts not succeeded, it is likely that Theodor Herzl's his proposals for a Jewish state would not have been considered feasible. Why do I compare the early efforts of progressive Judaism in Israel to the Bilu? Because we too have endured opposition and frustration, but through it all we have persevered. Like the Bilu, we too are comparatively few in number, but also like the Bilu, we have demonstrated that without the participation of progressive Judaism, Israel would be incomplete and non-representative, just as without our being in Israel, we would be peripheral to Jewish destiny. I am convinced that the ramification of our efforts will yet reverberate with greater resonance in both Israel and the diaspora. I have yet another purpose in referring to the Bilu movement. The word Bilu, B-I-L-U, is based on a verse from Isaiah chapter 2, verse 5. Beit Yaakov, lechu v'nelcha ba'or Adonai. House of Jacob, come and let us walk by the light of the Lord. Bilu is an acronym of the first letter of the first four Hebrew words, House of Jacob, come and let us walk, because the members of the Bilu did not consider themselves religious. They purposely left out the last two words of the verse, Bor Adonai, by the light of the Lord. During the same decade, the Bilu was organized from Eastern Europe. The Central Conference of American Rabbis was organized in the United States. By an amazing coincidence, the CCAR selected as the motto to be inscribed in its lemdom 4 words from the same verse in Isaiah. But since in those days the Reform rabbis were consciously trying to expunge Zionism and Jewish peoplehood from their vocabulary, they deleted the first 2 words, Beit Yaakov, House of Jacob, representing Jewish peoplehood. But they did retain the last 4 words of the verse, Lechu v'nelcha ba'or Adonai, come and let us walk by the light of the Lord. I consider this to be remarkable. The identical verse from Isaiah was used by the first Zionists and by the first Reform anti-Zionists. Today, I see this coincidence as prophetic. We are challenged to complete the cycle and to eliminate the dichotomies. The entire Jewish people is desperately in search of wholeness and unity of purpose. In order to flourish, we require all components, people, land, faith, culture, language, common goals, and shared destiny. Today, our movement can inculcate in Klal Yisrael a passionate commitment to strive to fulfill the entire clarion call. That is our message. That is our mission. Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha b'or Adonai. House of Jacob, come and let us walk together by the light of the Lord.